Well, thank you all. Thank you, Brian, for inviting me to present my empirical research. Thanks to the organizers for putting on such a well-run event. And so my purpose here today is really just to describe the results of my empirical research based on a survey that I administered in March of 2022. And there were a couple purposes behind conducting this survey. The first is to go beyond anecdotes. From the start of the pandemic, throughout the pandemic, I've been speaking, I'm sure we've all been speaking with many fellow mediators, arbitrators, and ombuds, getting a sense of their experiences and how they've been responding to the pandemic. So this empirical research was really to identify trends and potential outlier experiences that could be inconsistent or consistent with some of the anecdotal conversations we've all been having with our peers. The third reason behind this empirical research was also to analyze the experiences based on different demographic groups. Our ADR community is large. There are many nuances within our community. So I wanted to tease out some of those nuances, and really I focused on three different demographic groups. First being the geographic regions, or are they practicing ADR in urban, suburban, or rural communities. The second is on household size. So are you in a household size of 1 to 2 people or in more than 2 people? And the third was on the type of ADR work. So specifically with arbitrators, ombuds, and mediators. And a fourth reason behind this survey, and really that justifies a lot of my work, is to gain greater insight into equity and access to justice issues that ODR can present for dispute resolution broadly. So those are the 4 justifications for this research, and I'll just zoom in on who the actual survey respondents were. There were a total, I hope everyone can see that, good, okay. There were a total of about 400 ADR practitioners who responded to this. I did not survey parties to a dispute resolution. There are some limitations in what I can do through IRB review. So this is really just focusing on ADR practitioners, and we can see that the vast majority of the respondents are coming from the United States, and it does have a decent amount of international representation in all corners of the world, really. So the top 5 states that responded to my survey are split between Illinois, California, New York, Texas, and Massachusetts. This is another limitation that I'll just say with my survey. There are 400 respondents, just about 45% of them are coming from 5 states. So that's just something to keep in mind when thinking about the results. And it's roughly split evenly, men and women, 52, roughly 52% are women who responded to the survey. And this is the splits between the type of role that the ADR practitioners have. A near majority are mediators, about 48, 49%. Arbitrators and ombuds also come in second, third, with educators and trainers as well. For the purposes of this, I'm really just focusing, as I mentioned earlier, on arbitrators, ombuds, and mediators. I don't get into the experiences of private consultants and educators as much as the other 3 here. And survey analysis, I'll just start off by, the first question was really when the pandemic started to affect people's work. And for the majority of respondents, about 52%, it started in March 2020 when our work was impacted. And the second largest contingent, January 2020, and then April and February 2020 were about 10% as well. And next, I want to move. Is there a way of minimizing the bar there? Yeah.
I just hope I can remember it.
Oh, perfect. Yeah. So the second question that I wanted to zoom in on for survey respondents was total physical meetings, and I guess it's a bit hard to see the x-axis at the bottom, but it's focused on between 2019, which is shorthand for pre-pandemic, and 2022, which is shorthand for the first quarter, the first 3 months of 2022. So 2019 pre-pandemic, the first quarter of 2022. And what we see, left side of the chart here is total physical meetings with colleagues, and right side is total physical meetings with parties. So what we see is over the course of the pandemic, which is unsurprising, drastically fewer practitioners are meeting with colleagues and parties in person in physical meetings. Now, what I found interesting was that this survey was administered focusing on the first quarter of 2022, which is when a lot of the restrictions were being lifted and a lot of the mask mandates were being lifted. And really, despite those changes in policy, we're still seeing high rates of people not conducting physical meetings with parties and colleagues. So I guess this is only May, and only time will tell in 2023, 2024, whether this trend continues, where total physical meetings are happening less frequently than prior to the pandemic. Next, I filtered based on region. So overall, we're seeing that based on region, so this is rural, suburban, and urban. Overall, we're seeing everyone, and if I can move this too, you'll see the chart here. Overall, we're seeing that whether it's rural, suburban, or urban, the general trend is following the macro trend where there are less physical meetings that are happening in person during Q1 2022. The caveat here and the distinction here is really that the rural communities have the greatest separation from suburban and urban communities. So what we see, rural practitioners are still meeting close to a majority, if not more than a majority of them, are still meeting with parties and colleagues at least twice a week, relative to suburban and urban folks who are meeting at a much lower rate than their rural peers as well. And I'll come back to this later. What I found, another unique aspect of this, is that workspace satisfaction, how satisfied individuals are with their workspace, is still incredibly high, despite the fact that total physical meetings are happening at a much lower frequency than before the pandemic started. And if you have any questions on the charts, I'm here to explain, so feel free to jump in. So the next that I wanted to zoom in on is based on household size. So smaller household size, this is 1 to 2 individuals in a household, and then larger household size, this is 3 or more in a household size. And implicitly, like I'm trying to explore whether individuals who have children, individuals who have roommates, all these different things are altering how they are meeting with with parties and colleagues in person. And once again, just like with when it's filtered based on region, we're seeing the same trend. People, regardless of household size, are still meeting with parties and colleagues at lower rates compared to the pandemic during the first quarter of 2022. The caveat is that individuals who have greater than 3 individuals in their household are more likely to be meeting with parties and colleagues relative to individuals with smaller households. So that's just one small distinction there. The next is, one question I asked in the survey was, what, based on your role as an ADR practitioner, what your expectation is for meeting with individuals or conducting your work either predominantly online or exclusively online in the future. So this is split between 2023, 1 year from when the survey was administered, and 2027, 5 years from when the survey was administered. And the left side is focused on predominantly online. The question is whether you would meet in the future predominantly online with colleagues and with your parties. And we see here that at least for 2023, 1 year from when the survey was administered, the majority of people have confidence and expectations that they will continue to meet with parties predominantly online for the next calendar year. Things change when you shift 5 years into the future. That's where there's some amount of divergence. We see that arbitrators continue to expect to meet with parties at a slightly greater frequency. And then mediators and ombuds are the ones that are seeing less interest in meeting with parties and colleagues 5 years in the future. And then when I asked the question whether you'd be willing to conduct your work exclusively online, and this is just as a test more or less, to get an understanding of what arbitrators and mediators and ombuds are feeling, the vast majority, especially with arbitrators and ombuds, are less interested in working exclusively online, whether that's 2023 or 2027, 5 years in the future. Ombuds, I think, in many ways are the most unique because, as you'll see in future graphs, they are the most opinionated about a lot of issues. And I think that depends on, there's greater variation in the type of work that ombuds are doing relative to mediators and arbitrators. So typically what you'll see is that the level of indifference that ombuds have relative to arbitrators and mediators is significantly lower. And typically arbitrators or ombuds have stronger opinions on whether they want to meet in person, and they have also at the same time stronger opinions on whether they want to meet remotely with their people that they're helping resolve disputes. So this is similar to the last graph. Instead of focusing on role here, I'm just focusing on the region that the ADR practitioner is operating in. And what we see generally with future expectations based on 1 year or 5 years in the future is that similarly, whether it's predominantly or exclusively online, fewer people expect to be conducting their work online in 2027 versus in 2023. So there seems to be greater reception 1 year in the future to continuing their online dispute resolution or remote proceedings versus 5 years in the future. For both exclusively online and predominantly online, urban practitioners are more likely to be relatively indifferent or agnostic to conducting their work online, whether it's 2023 or 2027. So you see with predominantly online, there's some level of change over the 1 to 5 year time horizon, but it's significantly less than their suburban and urban peers. And then with exclusively online, there's basically no change. The near majority disagree that they would like to be in that situation 5 years or 1 year in the future. Whereas the contrast, especially once again with rural communities, there's greater divergence. There's a sharp drop in the level that they're interested in meeting predominantly online from 1 year to 5 year in the future. That goes from about 57% all the way down to 35% rural practitioners who are interested in meeting with parties and colleagues. And I'll just note once again, similar to ombuds, rural practitioners have a lower level of indifference, right? So they're less neutral when it comes to engaging exclusively online. That's where the sharper opinions in terms of level of disagreement really comes forth. So the next is future expectations based on household size. And overall, when it's 1 year in the future, there's very little difference between the household size, whether you're in a small household size or in a larger household size. The vast majority of people agree that 1 year in the future, their work will continue to be predominantly online. 5 years in the future, we still see some level of parity between the different household sizes in conducting work online. The drastic change comes when I ask the question on conducting work exclusively online. And here we see that smaller households have a higher level of opposition to conducting their work online relative to individuals in larger household sizes. And I think that's also a point to reference, because later on we'll see that individuals in smaller household sizes have slightly greater workspace satisfaction. And despite having greater workspace satisfaction, they still are less interested in conducting their work exclusively online, whether it's 1 or 5 years in the future. Any questions so far on what I've shared? Great. So this, to me, was the most important question of the survey, and that's, as a shorthand, 2019, once again, is pre-pandemic. 2020 is the start of the pandemic, the first 2 months of the pandemic, so March, April, or February 2020. And then 2022 is Q1 of this calendar year. And I say it's the most important question because whether people are satisfied with their workspace will really be an indication of whether they're willing to adopt online dispute resolution and remote proceedings in the foreseeable future. So when I break it down by role, we see that mediators and ombuds are the ones that have the sharpest increase comparing pre-pandemic work satisfaction to Q1 2022 workspace satisfaction. So for mediators and ombuds, they are more satisfied with their workspace today in Q1 2022 when compared to the pre-pandemic. And I think that's a really important note to just stick on. And arbitrators are more or less on par pre-pandemic versus the start of 2022 in terms of their workspace satisfaction. With ombuds, I've mentioned it earlier, they're the most unique. We see the level of indifference / neutrality really plummeting. So they are more opinionated once again about their workspace satisfaction currently in Q1. And we actually see, unlike mediators and arbitrators, we see both the level of satisfaction and the level of dissatisfaction increasing during Q1 2022. And that's because the ombuds who responded to this survey were less indifferent and they were more opinionated, and that went in different directions. And then when we focus in on the region that they are working from, whether it's rural, suburban, or urban, we're seeing rural communities are relatively flat. Pre-pandemic, the start of the pandemic, and also Q1, they're flat in terms of how satisfied they are with their workspace. That's different to suburban and urban communities. During the start of the pandemic, the first 2-3 months of the pandemic, there's this drastic reduction in workspace satisfaction as they're adapting to a new work environment. And that, similar to ombuds and mediators, goes back up to exceed workspace satisfaction relative to the pre-pandemic era. So for urban and suburban communities, they are more satisfied with their workspace today than prior to the start of the pandemic. The last piece I'll just talk about is, how am I doing on time, Brian?
You're good.
Great, okay. Great. The last piece I'll just talk about is who and which regions and which groups, which ADR roles are more willing to recommend online dispute resolution to their peers. And here we see, I asked 2 questions, whether they would recommend online dispute resolution to conduct their work predominantly online or exclusively online to their peers. And there's pretty sharp divergences. Basically, all arbitrators, mediators, and ombuds, they are responding with greater opposition to conducting exclusive online work relative to predominantly online. But when it comes to predominantly online, there is the same number of individuals who responded that they are in support of conducting their work predominantly online. It's on par with those who said that they are not interested in conducting their work online or recommending to their peers to conduct their work online. And then when we focus on the level of indifference, as I've mentioned earlier, ombuds, we see the greatest percentage of change with ombuds going from a high level of indifference, whether their work is predominantly online, and whether they would recommend their work to be predominantly online to others. And that goes down about 20 percentage points when asked the question about whether they would conduct or recommend to their peers to conduct their work exclusively online. And the effect of that is when there's less passiveness, there are sharper opinions. So people, the frequency that ombuds responded that they wouldn't recommend online dispute resolution was, that percentage increase was actually roughly the same as the percentage who said that they would recommend exclusive online work. So the next is based on region, and rural communities actually follow a similar trend to ombuds, where we see a greater level of passiveness or indifference to conducting their work predominantly online. And that level of indifference shrinks pretty dramatically when asked about conducting their work exclusively online. So rural communities have a lower level of indifference when they're asked to recommend to their peers, to other people in their community, to conduct online dispute resolution, exclusively online dispute resolution. Whereas we can see here with suburban and urban communities, they follow a similar trend when asked about recommending online dispute resolution to their peers. There's roughly the same percentage between urban and suburban who say they would recommend predominantly online work. And then that number, I would say, increases about 10 to 15% in terms of opposition to, in recommending exclusive online dispute resolution. Great. I actually wanted to end with this quote that I really like from Bridget McCormick, who's a judge in Michigan. And she says, "The pandemic was not the disruption any of us wanted, but it might be the disruption we needed to transform the judiciary into a more accessible, transparent, efficient, and customer-friendly branch of government." And so the hope is with this research that we get a better understanding of the groups who could be receptive to doing more work online. We also have a time horizon in terms of predictions that different communities have in doing their work online for the future. So that is it from me. I will just thank a couple people for supporting this empirical research. Sheila Heen, who's not here today, Colin Brule and Mediate.com, and the Center for Conflict Resolution in Chicago. They were all very supportive of this research. So thank you all.
Thank you so much. We have time for a question or two, I think.
Yeah.
But we got to just make sure you're mic'd for the visitors. Okay, great.
Thank you, Oladeji. This is, I have seen so many surveys of practitioners, and there's so much innovative and new that I've never seen in your data. That's very exciting. But one of the things that's fascinating is rural. I've not seen a breakdown by rural, urban, and suburban. And it seems to me a lot of the benefits of ODR would be even more pronounced for rural communities. But I'm sensing either an antipathy or a slight resistance. And I was wondering if you have any thoughts about why that might be in comparison to suburban and urban media people.
It's something that I spent a lot of time thinking about when I was analyzing the data. The number of physical meetings, for example, that rural communities are still having in person is much higher than urban and suburban peers. And one of the theories we could say is maybe in rural communities, there was less of a need compared to urban and suburban peers to move remotely, right? And so the benefits, certainly through anecdotal commentary, the benefits of online dispute resolution was coming from mediators, arbitrators who were really forced to conduct dispute resolution online. And rural communities did not have the same frequency or expectation or requirements to conduct their work online relative to their peers. So that's my theory. Yeah. Okay, perfect.
So a lot of the research that you gave, and thank you, is brilliant and very insightful. I wondered if you were ever able to open the hood and discover why, like why they felt the way that they felt, or was that not part of it? Because I just based on what you're saying about rule and ombudsman, I'm gathering some of this was sort of what you gathered, but not necessarily what was researched.
Yeah. So in the survey, it's mostly quantitative. It's very little qualitative. And there was an option for people to leave comments at the end about their experiences, comments that can't be captured in numbers. And I found it interesting that even though mediators were the near majority, ombuds were the ones who had the most commentary at the end of the survey. And the divergence, I wish I could have added some of the quotes, was really significant. Ombuds basically, especially university ombuds, felt liberated that they didn't have to require students, faculty, staff to come into a physical location, right? So they saw the benefit of that. And others were really preoccupied that they weren't able to engage with staff, faculty, and students in person. And they felt that that was really powerful for building community with people who had been going through challenges. So it's just comments that I'm able to suss out. I'm not sure how representative that is of the entire ombuds community, but there were really sharp opinions that were shared at the end of the survey, specifically for ombuds. Yeah, no problem. I think there's one here, but yeah.
Yeah, I'm just curious about the definition of workspace. In other words, a physical place could be a permanent office, or it could be a Starbucks, it could be nomadic.
Yeah. Is
there any split in terms of, permanent or nomadic workspace?
Yeah, I didn't actually get into, and obviously pre-pandemic, we're in a field with mediators, particularly who may not be tethered to a physical location. For the purposes of this survey, it was really just contrasting the pre-pandemic workspace with the post-pandemic or Q1 2022 workspace. So I didn't define specifically what the workspace is. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for this. I may have missed it in the presentation, but did you collect data on generational demographics? Was there any kind of divide there, and what did that look like? What do we learn from that?
Yeah, so I'm actually going to be sharing the full report with you, Brian, and then the link can just be circulated with everyone. I did do age group, and I also did number of years as a practitioner. As a proxy, I felt that and this is just a decision-making that I had to do on my own, I felt that household size would be more impactful for adoption of, or for gauging the differences in adopting information communication tools. So there is a breakdown based on a number of years as a practitioner as well in the final report.
I have the mic.
Yeah, clear.
So very fascinating results. And I'm assuming some of this went to reinforce hypotheses that you already had. What I'm wondering is what surprised you the most?
We touched on it earlier. I didn't anticipate that ombuds and rural practitioners would be that much of outliers, especially with ombuds. Arbitrators and mediators, I guess I've been engaging with them more frequently. They all had overall positive anecdotal descriptions of what happened during the pandemic. And there's a chart here where we see that, that ombuds both increased and decreased in levels of support for conducting their work online. That is, like, relative to their peers, fewer were neutral about it. They were more opinionated. And that was really surprising to me. Yeah.
One more maybe.
Just great presentation. Quick question. Has the results of this study been published at the journal, or are you working on
It's
it?
going to be circulated
Excellent.
at the end of this conference. Yes. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, one more.
It's okay.
He's keeping fit.
Yes, tremendous presentation. Very briefly, do I take it your use of the term ombuds or ombudsman is very much the American interpretation of dealing with disputes against public authorities? Over in the UK, it's equally dealing with retail sales, furniture ombudsman, landlord and tenant banking, which is a broader.
Yeah.
Did you deal with it from just the public authority dispute?
Yeah, that's a good question. I let individuals define their role. So when I circulated the survey internationally and nationally, the individuals could select what their primary role was. So, and I wanted to do that so that there would, because I know even the term mediator in India is different from what it is in the US, you know. So I wanted the individuals to have kind of the autonomy to self-describe. Yeah, but it is, and I could even add that as an additional limitation of the survey, because there are different definitions of what an ombuds could be based on the geography that they're operating in as well. So that's something to keep in mind.
And if it's an employer,
Yeah.
employee,
Yeah.
with the dispute, see the need to be there.
Yeah.
It's more,
Exactly.
Well, Oladeji, thank you very much.
Yeah.
I'm going to call it
Thank you.
at that for the benefit. And thank you so much.